The cruelest thing about losing someone is realizing they were the reason your life felt warm in the first place. The city of Chicago glittered outside the hospital windows like a sea of cold diamonds, thousands of white lights flickering beneath the heavy rain falling across downtown streets. But inside the executive recovery wing of Carter Memorial Hospital, everything felt painfully silent. Ethan Carter sat alone in the dark corner of a private consultation room, his elbows resting on his knees, his expensive charcoal suit wrinkled for the first time in years. The fluorescent lights above him hummed softly. Somewhere down the hallway, a heart monitor beeped in slow, steady rhythm. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee lingered in the air. It was nearly 2 a.m. And for once, the most powerful hospital CEO in Illinois looked exhausted enough to collapse. His father had suffered another cardiac episode 2 hours earlier. The doctors had stabilized him, but the prognosis was uncertain. Ethan stared blankly at the untouched paper cup beside him, cold black coffee sitting forgotten in his hand. He had spent most of his life believing control could fix anything. Money fixed problems. Power fixed delays. Intelligence fixed weakness. But tonight, sitting alone while rain crawled down the giant glass windows behind him, none of those things mattered. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar pressing against his chest. Fear. The consultation room door opened quietly. Ethan barely looked up. "You haven't eaten since this morning." Her voice was soft, calm, almost annoyingly gentle. Clara Bennett stepped inside carrying a small paper bag and a cup with steam curling from the lid. She wore light blue scrubs beneath a cream cardigan that looked too warm and human for a hospital this cold. A few loose strands of blonde hair had escaped her ponytail during her shift, framing tired blue eyes that somehow still carried warmth after 14 hours on her feet. Ethan glanced at the food before looking away again. "I'm not hungry." Clara walked closer anyway. "That's funny," she said quietly, "because your stomach's been growling loud enough to scare the nurses on the 4th floor." He almost smiled. Almost. Clara set the cup beside him. Chamomile tea. She remembered. Somehow she always remembered things no one else noticed. Ethan leaned back slowly, rubbing one hand across his jaw. "You don't have to babysit me, Clara." "Good," she replied softly, "because babysitting requires sleep, and I haven't had that in about 22 hours. That finally pulled the smallest breath of amusement from him. Tiny, brief, but real. Clara noticed immediately. She always noticed. The room fell quiet again except for the rain tapping softly against the windows. Ethan stared down at the steam rising from the teacup. "You should go home." Clara sat beside him instead. "You say that every night. And you ignore me every night." "Pretty much." Ethan shook his head slowly. Most people feared him. Board members lowered their voices around him. Residents straightened their posture when he entered a room. Investors called him ruthless behind closed doors. At 38, Ethan Carter had built one of the largest private medical networks in the country by never allowing emotion to interfere with logic. He was efficient, precise, untouchable. But Clara Bennett talked to him like none of that mattered. Like he was just another exhausted man sitting in a hospital at 2 a.m., trying not to fall apart. And somehow that terrified him more than any business deal ever had. Clara opened the paper bag and pulled out half a turkey sandwich. "Eat." Ethan exhaled slowly. "You're very bossy for a nurse. Occupational hazard." She held the sandwich closer. "Take the sandwich, Mr. Carter." He looked at her finally. Really looked at her. Her eyes were tired. There were faint shadows beneath them from working double shifts all week. But she still smiled at him anyway. Not because he owned the building. Not because of his money. Not because she wanted something. Clara smiled at everyone that way. Patients, janitors, elderly volunteers, scared children waiting for surgery. She carried warmth into rooms that had forgotten what warmth felt like. Ethan took the sandwich without another argument. Clara smiled softly like she'd just won a small invisible battle. "There we go." He took a bite in silence. The tea warmed his hands. Outside, thunder rolled low across the city skyline. Clara leaned back beside him, pulling her cardigan tighter around herself. "My dad used to hate hospitals," she said quietly after a moment. Ethan glanced sideways. "Your dad?" She nodded. "Said hospitals smelled like loneliness." Ethan stared forward again. Was he wrong? Clara looked toward the rain-soaked windows. "No," she admitted softly. "Not always." Her honesty settled into the silence between them. Ethan swallowed slowly. "My father built this place. I know. He used to walk these halls every morning at 6 sharp. Clara smiled faintly. "You walk them exactly the same way." Ethan frowned slightly. "No, I don't." "You do." Her voice stayed gentle. "Same pace. Same coffee. Same expression like the world's about to disappoint you." He let out a quiet breath through his nose. "That sounds dramatic." "It's accurate." Another silence. Softer this time. Easier. Clara looked down at his untouched tea again. "You know," she said carefully, "it's okay to be scared." Ethan's jaw tightened instantly. There it was. The dangerous part about Clara Bennett. She saw things he worked very hard to hide. "I'm not scared." Clara gave him a tiny look. "Ethan." The way she said his name felt different. Not professional. Not distant. Just human. Real. It hit him harder than it should have. Ethan looked away first. "People depend on me," he said quietly. "This hospital depends on me. That doesn't mean you stop being a person." His expression hardened slightly. "Feelings don't fix problems." Clara studied him for a long moment. "No," she whispered, "but pretending you don't have any usually creates bigger ones." Ethan suddenly stood, restless energy tightening across his shoulders. He walked toward the giant window overlooking downtown Chicago. Rain streaked across the glass like silver lines. Traffic crawled below in red and white blurs. "You know what the difference is between you and me?" he asked quietly. Clara stayed seated. "What?" "You still believe people stay." The room became still. Ethan immediately regretted saying it. Clara lowered her eyes briefly before standing and walking toward him slowly. She stopped beside him near the window, close enough for him to feel her warmth. "Some people do stay," she said softly. Ethan stared at the city below. "Not forever." Clara looked at him carefully. "Forever's overrated." He finally turned toward her then. Their eyes met in the reflection of the rain-covered glass. For one strange, suspended second, the noise of the hospital disappeared completely. No monitors, no footsteps, no thunder, just her. Clara gave him the faintest smile. "Right now is enough sometimes." Ethan felt something dangerous shift quietly inside his chest. Something warm, something alive, and that frightened him more than being alone ever had. The next morning, Carter Memorial Hospital woke before the sun did. The lobby floors gleamed beneath soft white lights. Nurses moved quickly between elevators carrying tablets and coffee cups, and the smell of fresh disinfectant mixed with bakery pastries from the cafe near the East Wing. Outside, downtown Chicago was still gray from last night's rain, but inside the hospital, everything already pulsed with movement. Ethan Carter walked through the main corridor exactly at 6:10 a.m. Like he always did. Dark navy suit, silver watch, black coffee in hand. Calm expression sharp enough to make interns straighten their backs when he passed. He moved quickly, speaking into his phone without slowing down once. "Move the board meeting to Thursday." His voice was low and controlled. "And tell legal I want the revised acquisition reports before noon." Staff members nodded as he walked past them. Some greeted him nervously. Others simply stepped aside. Ethan rarely noticed either reaction anymore. Control had become muscle memory. Predictable, efficient, safe. He ended the call as he stepped into the executive elevator, finally alone for the first time all morning. The doors began sliding shut. Then a hand appeared between them. "Hold that, please." The elevator reopened. Clara Bennett stepped inside balancing 2 coffee trays and a paper bag tucked awkwardly beneath one arm. A strand of blonde hair fell across her cheek as she pushed the elevator button with her elbow. Ethan stared at the overloaded trays. Planning to caffeinate the entire hospital? Clara looked up, startled for half a second before smiling. Only the pediatric wing. She adjusted the trays carefully. Today is flu shot day. Ethan grimaced slightly. Sounds miserable. You would be shocked how brave 6-year-olds become when bribed with blueberry muffins. The elevator began moving. Clara shifted the coffee trays again, clearly struggling to balance them. Ethan reached out automatically, steadying one before it slipped. Their hands brushed briefly, warm skin against cold fingers. Clara blinked up at him. Thank you. Ethan released the tray immediately. You should make someone help you carry all this. Clara smiled faintly. Everybody's already drowning this morning. Ethan looked at her for a moment. She said things like that often. Not complaining, just noticing. Clara noticed everyone. The exhausted residents. The janitor with arthritis in his knee. The volunteer who skipped lunch to save money. She carried people quietly without making it look heavy. The elevator dinged softly at the pediatric floor. Clara stepped out carefully before pausing. Oh! She reached into the paper bag and pulled out a blueberry muffin wrapped in a napkin. Peace offering. Ethan stared at it. For what? For surviving another 12-hour day of pretending you are not exhausted. She placed it into his free hand before he could answer. Then she disappeared down the hallway. Coffee trays balanced carefully as colorful cartoon murals reflected across the polished floors around her. Ethan stood there alone after the elevator doors closed again, looking down at the muffin in his hand like it was some kind of foreign object. By 9:30 a.m., the hospital boardroom felt cold enough to freeze conversation. 10 executives sat around the massive walnut conference table while digital presentations flashed across giant screens mounted on the walls. Ethan stood near the head of the table reviewing expansion plans for a new surgical center in Milwaukee. Numbers, revenue forecasts, staffing projections. Everything clean, precise, logical. Construction begins in January, Ethan said calmly. We anticipate a 22% increase in regional surgical intake within 18 months. The board members nodded approvingly. One investor leaned forward. And what about patient satisfaction metrics? Ethan barely glanced up from the report. Up 8% from last quarter. Impressive. Another executive smiled carefully. Your father would be proud. Something tightened almost invisibly across Ethan's expression. Only for a second. But enough. He continued speaking anyway. Next item. No emotion. No pause. Just movement forward. The meeting stretched another 90 minutes before finally ending. Ethan remained behind gathering documents while the city skyline glowed pale silver beyond the windows. The room emptied slowly until only silence remained. Then someone knocked lightly against the open door. Clara stepped inside carrying a tablet. Sorry, she said softly. I need your signature for the pediatric equipment authorization. Ethan accepted the tablet without looking up. You could have sent this through administration. I could have. She leaned lightly against the doorframe. But administration scares me. Ethan signed the form quickly. Administration should scare everyone. Clara laughed quietly. It was a small sound. Warm. Effortless. The kind that lingered longer than it should. Ethan handed back the tablet. How many coffees today? 6. That explains the energy. No, she replied. That is just my personality. Ethan almost smiled again. Dangerous. He had started doing that around her too often lately. Clara glanced toward the untouched muffin wrapper sitting near his paperwork. Empty. Her eyes softened slightly. You ate it. Ethan noticed the look immediately. It was adequate. Clara gasped softly in fake offense. Adequate. Possibly above average. Wow. She pressed a hand dramatically against her chest. Such overwhelming praise from the mighty Ethan Carter. He shook his head quietly, but something inside him loosened anyway. Clara pushed herself away from the doorway. Well, I should get back downstairs. She hesitated slightly. Your father asked about you this morning. Ethan's shoulders stiffened. What did he say? He wanted to know if you slept. Ethan looked away toward the windows. I had work. Clara studied him carefully. That was not the question. Silence settled between them. Familiar now. Ethan hated how easily she stepped through his defenses. Most people accepted the version of him he presented to the world. Clara kept searching beneath it. You cannot keep running on 3 hours of sleep, she said gently. Ethan gave a dry laugh. Watch me. That is not healthy. Neither is caring this much about other people's problems. Clara's expression softened instead of hardening. Maybe not, she admitted quietly. But it makes life feel less empty. Ethan looked at her then. Really looked at her again. There was no judgment in her face. No pity. Just honesty. Warm, steady honesty that somehow made the giant boardroom feel less cold. Clara glanced at the clock on the wall. I have to go. She turned toward the door before stopping one last time. You know, she said softly without facing him fully, somebody should take care of you too once in a while. Then she walked away. Ethan remained motionless beside the conference table long after she disappeared down the hallway. The city stretched endlessly outside the windows below him. Cold streets, endless traffic, gray skies pressing down over Chicago like concrete. But for the first time all morning, his mind stayed fixed on one thing only. Somebody should take care of you too. That sentence followed him through the rest of the day like a quiet echo he could not shut off. By evening, the hospital corridors dimmed beneath softer lights as visiting hours ended. Ethan finally stepped into his private office overlooking the river. The room was spotless, minimalist, untouched, exactly how he preferred it. He loosened his tie slowly and sat behind his desk. His phone buzzed nonstop with emails and financial alerts, but his attention drifted elsewhere. Then he noticed something sitting beside his laptop. A cup of chamomile tea, still warm. Beside it sat a yellow sticky note written in small neat handwriting. Try sleeping before midnight tonight. The world will survive without you for 6 hours. Ethan stared at the note silently. Then, despite himself, he picked up the tea and took a slow sip while the lights of Chicago flickered against the dark glass around him. 3 days later, Ethan realized something dangerous was happening to him. He had started looking for Clara Bennett before he even entered a room. The realization hit him on a Thursday evening while stepping out of the elevator onto the cardiac floor. His eyes searched automatically for the soft cream cardigan she always wore over her scrubs during night shifts. He noticed immediately when she was not there. The hallway suddenly felt colder without understanding why. Ethan frowned slightly at himself and continued walking. This was exactly the kind of emotional distraction he avoided. Predictable routines became attachments. Attachments became weaknesses. Weaknesses became pain. He had learned that lesson years ago watching his mother disappear slowly inside sterile hospital walls while his father buried himself in work instead of grief. Since then, Ethan had spent most of his adult life building walls no one could cross. The problem was Clara never seemed interested in climbing walls at all. She simply walked around them. You look terrible. Ethan looked up from his tablet as Clara appeared beside him near the nurse station carrying patient charts against her chest. Good evening to you too, he replied dryly. Clara tilted her head slightly. Did you sleep at all? For approximately 4 hours. That is not sleep. That is a medically concerning nap. Ethan continued reviewing documents. I survived. Barely. She narrowed her eyes at him carefully. And your tie does not even match today. Ethan glanced down automatically. Dark charcoal tie. Navy suit. It matches. No, Clara said immediately. It surrendered. A young nurse nearby covered a laugh before quickly pretending to organize paperwork. Ethan looked genuinely offended for half a second. Clara smiled victoriously. There he is. Who? The human being hiding underneath all the expensive suits. Ethan shook his head quietly, but the corner of his mouth betrayed him again. Clara noticed instantly. She always did. The nurse station buzzed softly around them with phones ringing and distant footsteps echoing through polished corridors. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed quietly. Somewhere else, A tired father asked a doctor hopeful questions in a trembling voice. Hospitals carried every human emotion imaginable beneath one roof. Fear, relief, grief, hope. Clara moved through all of it with astonishing gentleness. Ethan had started noticing the small things lately. The way she crouched beside elderly patients so they did not have to strain their necks speaking upward. The way she memorized family names. The way scared children stopped crying when she entered a room carrying stickers and apple juice cups like peace offerings. Even the janitors smiled when Clara passed them in the hallways. It made no logical sense. One person should not change the atmosphere of an entire floor just by existing there. But somehow she did. Clara glanced toward his untouched coffee cup. That is your third coffee today. Fourth. Ethan. I have meetings. You also have functioning organs to protect. He sighed quietly. Are all nurses secretly this bossy? Only the good ones. She reached beside him, sliding a granola bar across the counter toward him. Eat something before your body files a formal complaint. Ethan stared at the granola bar. You carry emergency snacks now? Only for emotionally unavailable hospital executives. One of the residents nearly choked trying not to laugh nearby. Ethan shot the young doctor a look sharp enough to send him walking quickly down the hall. Clara smiled into her charts. You scare everyone, you know? That is usually the goal. It should not be. Ethan studied her face quietly then. You are not scared of me. Clara looked up calmly. Should I be? Probably. She considered that for a moment before shrugging lightly. I think you are harder on yourself than you are on anyone else. The statement landed deeper than Ethan expected. He looked away first. Dangerous again. Clara had an unsettling habit of speaking directly into places he spent years hiding. Before Ethan could answer, alarms sounded softly from one of the nearby rooms. Clara moved instantly, all warmth replaced by sharp professional focus. I will be right back. Ethan watched her disappear through the doorway with two other nurses following behind her. The floor returned to motion around him, but his attention stayed fixed on the closed hospital room door longer than it should have. 20 minutes later, Ethan found himself outside the pediatric wing after finishing another exhausting board call. Colorful paper stars hung from the ceiling. Crayon drawings covered the walls beside patient rooms. Somewhere down the hallway, a little girl laughed loudly enough to echo through the corridor. Ethan rarely visited this wing personally. Children made him uncomfortable. Their honesty did. Adults hid emotions behind professionalism and politeness. Children looked directly at sadness without pretending not to see it. As Ethan passed one of the playrooms, he slowed unexpectedly. Clara sat cross-legged on the floor beside a young boy wearing dinosaur pajamas, building a crooked block tower together. The little boy giggled every time the tower collapsed. Clara laughed too, full and real and completely different from the polite smiles she gave most adults. Ethan stopped without meaning to. Clara noticed him standing there through the glass. Her expression softened immediately. She excused herself gently from the game and stepped into the hallway. What are you doing up here? She asked quietly. Ethan glanced toward the playroom awkwardly. Inspection. Clara raised one eyebrow slowly. Inspection? Possibly. At 9 o'clock at night? Ethan cleared his throat slightly. The tower construction seemed unstable. Clara stared at him for one long second before laughing softly. Ethan felt something tighten strangely inside his chest at the sound. You are smiling again, Clara observed. No, I am not. You absolutely are. Ethan looked away toward the windows at the end of the hallway. Snow had started falling lightly across the city outside, tiny white flakes drifting through the Chicago night beneath streetlights glowing gold. Clara stepped beside him quietly. Beautiful, huh? Ethan followed her gaze toward the snow. Cold. Clara smiled faintly. That too. For a moment neither of them spoke. The hallway lights dimmed slightly for overnight hours, wrapping everything in softer shadows. Ethan realized suddenly how tired he was. Not physically. Deeper than that. Tired in the kind of way sleep never fixed. Clara leaned gently against the wall beside him. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan nodded once. "When was the last time you took a day off?" "I do not remember." "That is unhealthy." "That word again." Clara glanced sideways at him. "You built an entire hospital system dedicated to helping people stay alive, Ethan." Her voice softened carefully. "Maybe you deserve the same effort." He let out a quiet breath. "I would not know what to do with myself." "That is actually kind of sad." Ethan looked down at her then. "You think I am sad?" Clara held his gaze without hesitation. "No," her voice became almost unbearably gentle. "I think you are lonely." The words settled heavily into the silence between them. Ethan immediately looked away toward the falling snow outside the windows, because the terrifying part was not hearing her say it. The terrifying part was realizing she was right. Clara noticed the shift in his expression and instantly softened further. "Hey," she said quietly, "that was not meant to hurt you." Ethan swallowed once. "It did not." Another lie. Clara stepped closer before reaching up carefully toward his collar. Ethan stiffened instinctively as her fingers adjusted his crooked tie beneath the soft hallway lights. Warm hands. Gentle touch. Simple. Innocent. But his heartbeat reacted anyway. Clara smiled faintly while straightening the fabric. "There," she whispered. "Now you look slightly less miserable." Ethan stared down at her for one suspended second too long. Clara seemed to realize it too because her smile faded into something quieter. Softer. The hallway suddenly felt too small around them. Too warm. Somewhere behind them, a child laughed again inside the playroom. Clara slowly lowered her hand from his tie. "You should probably go home tonight," she said softly. Ethan's eyes stayed on hers. "You say that every night." "Maybe because nobody else does." He did not answer. Could not. Because standing there beneath dim hospital lights while snow drifted outside the windows, Ethan Carter realized something that frightened him more than loneliness ever had. Clara Bennett was becoming the first part of his day that actually felt like living. By December, the entire hospital had started noticing it. Ethan Carter no longer walked through Carter Memorial looking like a man preparing for war every morning. The difference was subtle. Small enough that most executives would never mention it aloud. But the nurses noticed. Receptionists noticed. Even patients noticed. The cold, unreachable CEO, who used to move through the hospital like a shadow, had started lingering in hallways longer than necessary. Especially near the pediatric wing. Especially near Clara Bennett. Snow covered Chicago in soft white layers the week before Christmas, wrapping the city in glowing lights and icy wind. Inside the hospital, paper snowflakes decorated nurse stations, while tiny artificial trees blinked softly near waiting rooms. Children in recovery rooms wore red Santa hats over hospital gowns. Someone from administration played old jazz Christmas music too loudly through the lobby speakers every morning. Clara loved all of it. Ethan discovered this accidentally one evening while passing the pediatric floor after another endless meeting. He stopped when he heard laughter echoing through the hallway. Real laughter. Warm enough to cut through the exhausting noise of the hospital. Clara stood near the nurse's station helping a little boy tape crooked paper ornaments onto a tiny Christmas tree. Her blonde hair had fallen loose from her ponytail again, and there was green glitter on one sleeve of her cardigan. "That star is upside down," she told the boy gently. "No," the little boy argued proudly. "It is modern art." Clara gasped dramatically. "Wow, you sound exactly like my cousin after 2 glasses of wine." The boy burst into giggles. Ethan stayed frozen near the hallway entrance longer than he should have. Watching her. There was something dangerous about moments like this. Clara did not know anyone was looking at her. She was not trying to impress anyone. Not performing kindness. Just living inside it naturally. One of the nurses noticed Ethan first and straightened immediately. "Good evening, Mr. Carter." Clara turned around. The second her eyes landed on him, her entire face softened. Ethan hated how much he had started waiting for that look. "Well," Clara smiled lightly. "Look who escaped another meeting." Ethan walked closer slowly. "I heard rumors there was glitter involved up here." Clara looked down at her sleeve. Occupational hazard. The little boy beside her pointed directly at Ethan. You look grumpy. Clara covered her mouth instantly, trying not to laugh. Ethan stared down at the child with complete seriousness. That is because I own the hospital. Oh, the boy considered this carefully. Can you own less of it? Clara failed to hide her laughter this time. Ethan looked at her, pretending annoyance. You are encouraging rebellion among patients now? Only the honest ones. The little boy tugged Clara's sleeve. Is he your boyfriend? Silence. Immediate. Absolute. Two nearby nurses suddenly became very interested in organizing clipboards. Ethan blinked once. Clara nearly dropped the ornament box in her hands. No, she answered quickly, cheeks turning pink. Mr. Carter is just... She hesitated. Ethan looked at her curiously. Just terrifying in an expensive suit, Clara finished finally. The little boy nodded seriously. Yeah, I can see that. Ethan surprised himself by laughing quietly. Actually laughing. Low and real and unfamiliar enough that several nurses looked up in shock. Clara stared at him like she had just witnessed a medical miracle. Wow, she whispered dramatically. Someone document this moment. Ethan shook his head, but his eyes stayed on her longer than necessary. Later that night, Clara found Ethan alone on the rooftop terrace outside the executive wing. Snowflakes drifted softly across the city skyline while freezing wind swept between nearby buildings. Ethan stood near the railing in a black wool coat, one hand wrapped around a coffee cup while Chicago glowed beneath him in silver and gold lights. Clara stepped outside carrying another paper cup carefully between her hands. I knew I would find you here. Ethan glanced sideways. Should you be outside in this weather? Probably not. She walked beside him anyway. But you looked like someone carrying the weight of the entire city again. Ethan stared out at the skyline. Occupational hazard. Clara smiled softly at hearing her own words repeated back. She handed him the second cup. Chamomile tea. Ethan accepted it automatically now. Like routine. Like expectation. Clara leaned against the railing beside him. My mom used to love Christmas, she said quietly after a moment. She made cinnamon rolls every Christmas Eve no matter how broke we were. Ethan glanced at her. You were broke. Clara laughed softly. Very. Snowflakes landed gently in her hair. My dad worked construction. My mom cleaned hotel rooms. Her smile turned smaller. Some winters the heat barely worked. Ethan listened quietly. Clara rarely talked about herself deeply. She usually redirected conversations toward other people before anyone could ask too many questions. But every Christmas morning, she continued softly, my mom would light candles and pretend our tiny apartment was magical. Ethan looked down at the steam rising from his tea. Did it work? Clara smiled toward the snowy skyline. Yeah. Her voice became quieter. Actually, it did. Ethan felt something ache unexpectedly inside his chest. Clara had this unsettling ability to make simple things sound important. Warm apartments, cinnamon rolls, paper snowflakes, things Ethan stopped noticing years ago while chasing bigger goals. More money, more hospitals, more control. What about you? Clara asked gently. Ethan's expression shifted instantly. Closed again. My family was different. Clara waited patiently. Ethan sighed once. My father worked constantly. Snow drifted around them in silence. After my mother died, work became the only thing he understood anymore. Clara's face softened carefully. How old were you? 14. That is too young. Ethan stared toward the river below them. He thought building bigger hospitals would somehow make losing her feel less pointless. Clara looked at him quietly for several seconds before speaking. And you? Ethan frowned slightly. What about me? What do you do when things hurt? The question landed too directly. Ethan gave a humorless smile. I work. Clara's eyes saddened slightly. That is not the same as healing. Wind swept across the rooftop harder this time. Clara rubbed her cold hands together before Ethan noticed her shiver slightly. Without thinking, he removed one glove and reached toward her sleeve. Tiny pieces of glitter still clung to the fabric from earlier. Ethan brushed one away carefully. Clara looked down at his hand against her arm. The city noise below them faded into distance. "You missed one," Ethan murmured quietly. Clara's heartbeat suddenly betrayed her. She stepped back gently, smiling nervously. "The glitter situation is getting out of control." Ethan slowly lowered his hand. Something unspoken lingered between them now. Fragile. Dangerous. Clara cleared her throat softly. "You know," she said carefully, "the nurses have a theory about you." Ethan raised one eyebrow. "That sounds threatening." "It is." She smiled faintly. "They think you secretly care about people more than you pretend to." Ethan looked away immediately. "That is ridiculous." "Is it?" Clara stepped closer beside him again. "You remember every janitor's name. That is management. You paid for a patient's surgery anonymously last month." Ethan frowned slightly. "How do you know that?" Clara smiled knowingly. "Because nurses know everything." Ethan exhaled quietly. "The family could not afford the procedure." "Exactly." Her voice softened. "You care." He stared out at the snowy city again, jaw tightening slightly. "Caring makes people weak." Clara looked at him for a long moment before answering. "No," she whispered gently. "Losing people makes them afraid to care again." Ethan's chest tightened instantly because she was too close to the truth. Too close to understanding him in ways nobody had for years. Snow continued falling around them beneath the soft glow of rooftop lights. Clara reached into her coat pocket suddenly and pulled something out. Pair of knitted gloves. Dark gray wool. "I made these," she said shyly. Ethan blinked in surprise. "You knit?" "Badly." Clara laughed softly. "But your hands are always freezing." She held the gloves toward him carefully. Ethan stared down at them without moving. Nobody had made something for him in years. Not because they wanted something in return. Not because of business. Just because they noticed he was cold. Clara misread his silence instantly and pulled back slightly. "Sorry. That was probably weird." Ethan reached for the gloves before she could put them away. His fingers brushed hers again. Warm. Familiar now somehow. "Thank you," he said quietly. Clara looked genuinely surprised hearing softness in his voice like that. Ethan slipped the gloves on slowly. They fit perfectly. Clara smiled then. Small. Nervous. Beautiful enough to make the entire freezing rooftop suddenly feel warmer. And standing there beneath falling snow while Chicago glittered endlessly around them, Ethan Carter realized something terrifying. He had started needing these moments with Clara Bennett far more than he wanted to admit. The first panic attack happened on a Tuesday night at 1:17 a.m. Ethan had experienced stress before. Crushing deadlines. Emergency board meetings. Financial collapses during expansion years. He knew exhaustion. He knew pressure. But this felt different. This felt like drowning quietly while standing perfectly still. The executive office overlooking downtown Chicago was dark except for the pale glow of computer screens reflecting across the glass walls. Snow fell heavily outside, turning the city into blurred white shadows beneath streetlights. Ethan sat alone behind his desk reviewing acquisition reports for the third time without absorbing a single word. His chest felt tight. Too tight. He loosened his tie slowly, exhaling once. Then again. The room suddenly seemed smaller somehow. The air thinner. His heartbeat stumbled hard against his ribs. Ethan frowned immediately. No, not now. He stood too quickly from the desk, gripping the edge as dizziness swept through him unexpectedly. His breathing turned shallow, sharp. Every sound inside the office became painfully loud. The humming heater, the ticking clock, his own heartbeat roaring in his ears. Ethan pressed one hand against his chest, forcing himself to inhale normally. Control it. He always controlled everything. But the panic only worsened. His vision blurred slightly around the edges. For one terrifying second, he thought he might actually collapse. Then the office door opened quietly. "Ethan?" Clara stepped inside carrying a folder against her chest before freezing instantly. Her expression changed the second she saw him. "Hey!" Her voice softened immediately. "Look at me." Ethan turned away automatically, embarrassed by how weak he suddenly felt. "I am fine." Clara crossed the room without hesitation. "No, you are not." She set the folder down quickly before stopping directly in front of him. "Can you breathe slowly for me?" Ethan clenched his jaw tightly. "I said I am fine." "Ethan." Her voice remained calm, steady. "You are having a panic attack." The words hit him like humiliation. Ethan Carter did not panic. Ethan Carter solved problems, led billion-dollar organizations, made impossible decisions without blinking. But Clara looked at him like none of those titles mattered right now, like he was simply a frightened human being struggling to breathe. "Sit down," she said gently. Ethan shook his head once. "I cannot." "Yes, you can." She guided him carefully toward the couch near the windows before he could argue further. Ethan sat heavily, one hand still pressed against his chest. Clara knelt slightly in front of him, blue eyes focused entirely on his face. "Listen to me," she whispered softly. "Nothing bad is happening to you." Ethan's breathing remained uneven. "It does not feel that way." "I know." Her voice stayed impossibly calm. "But feelings lie sometimes." Snow drifted heavily outside behind her while Chicago lights flickered faintly through the storm. Clara reached for his trembling hand slowly, giving him time to pull away if he wanted. He did not. Her fingers wrapped gently around his. Warm, grounding, real. "Breathe with me," she said quietly. "Slow." Ethan focused on her voice because it was the only thing keeping him anchored. "Inhale. Exhale." Again. Clara stayed there patiently through every shaky breath, every moment of silence, every crack in the armor he spent years building around himself. She never looked uncomfortable, never judgmental, just present, completely present. Nearly 10 minutes passed before his heartbeat finally slowed enough for the room to stop spinning. Ethan leaned back against the couch, exhausted in a way he had never experienced before. Clara still sat beside him quietly now, one hand resting gently near his wrist like she wanted to make sure he was still there. Neither spoke immediately. The silence between them felt softer tonight, more intimate somehow. Ethan stared out at the snow-covered skyline beyond the windows. "I hate this." Clara looked at him carefully. "What part?" "Feeling weak." Her expression shifted instantly. "Ethan." He laughed humorlessly. "Do you know how embarrassing this is?" Clara's eyes saddened. "You think being human is embarrassing?" Ethan looked away again. "People depend on me." "And who do you depend on?" The question landed hard because he did not have an answer. Clara leaned back carefully against the couch beside him. "My mom used to get panic attacks after my dad lost his job," she said softly. "I was 12. Ethan stayed silent, listening. She would apologize every time it happened. Clara smiled faintly at the memory, like fear was somehow inconvenient for everyone else. Snow continued falling quietly outside while warm office lights reflected softly across the windows around them. "One night," Clara continued gently, "I asked her why she kept saying sorry." Ethan glanced sideways toward her. "What did she say?" Clara looked down briefly before answering. "She said strong people are not supposed to fall apart." Ethan swallowed slowly. Clara's voice became even softer. "But they do." Silence settled carefully around them. Ethan stared at her profile beside him, the exhaustion beneath her eyes, the kindness she carried so naturally it almost hurt to look at sometimes. Clara noticed him watching her and smiled lightly. "Your breathing is better. Thanks to you." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Clara's expression softened immediately. "You do not have to thank me for caring about you." Ethan's chest tightened again for an entirely different reason this time. "Caring about you." She said things like that too easily, too honestly. Dangerous words. Clara stood slowly from the couch. "You should not stay here tonight." Ethan rubbed one hand across his face tiredly. "I still have reports to finish." Clara gave him a look that immediately reminded him she spent most of her life dealing with stubborn patience. No, Clara. No, Ethan almost smiled despite himself. You are very bossy after midnight. And you are emotionally repressed 24 hours a day. Ethan actually laughed softly at that. Quiet. Tired. Real. Clara walked toward the small office kitchenette before returning a minute later carrying another cup of chamomile tea. She handed it to him carefully. Drink this. Ethan accepted it automatically now. Routine. Her tea. Her voice. Her presence. He had stopped questioning how naturally she fit into his life. Clara sat beside him again while he drank slowly. Outside, snow covered Chicago in complete silence. You know what I think? She asked quietly after a while. Ethan glanced sideways. That sounds dangerous. Clara smiled faintly. I think you spent so many years trying to become unbreakable. Her voice softened carefully. That you forgot people are supposed to need each other sometimes. Ethan stared down into the teacup, warming his hands. Nobody had ever spoken to him this way before. Not board members. Not investors. Not even family. Clara talked to him like she could see every lonely, exhausted piece of him beneath the expensive suits and controlled expressions. And somehow, she stayed anyway. Ethan suddenly realized Clara was still holding his wrist lightly without thinking about it. Her thumb rested gently against his pulse. Familiar now. Comfortable. He looked down at her hand before looking back at her face. Clara seemed to realize it too because her cheeks turned slightly pink. But she did not pull away immediately. Neither did he. The office felt strangely still around them. Warm. Quiet. Clara finally withdrew her hand carefully, clearing her throat softly. I should probably get back downstairs. Ethan nodded once, though disappointment flickered unexpectedly inside his chest. Clara stood and gathered the forgotten folder she originally came to deliver. Then she hesitated near the door. Ethan? Yeah. She looked at him carefully. You scared me tonight. Ethan's expression shifted instantly. Clara smiled sadly. I know you think you have to carry everything alone. Her eyes softened. But you do not. Then she walked out quietly, leaving behind the faint scent of chamomile tea and winter air. Ethan remained motionless on the couch long after the office door closed. Snow drifted endlessly beyond the windows while the city lights blurred beneath the storm. For the first time in years, the giant office no longer felt empty after someone left it. Felt wrong. Like warmth had disappeared from the room the second Clara Bennett walked away. And somewhere deep beneath all the fear and exhaustion he spent years hiding from the world, Ethan realized something terrifyingly simple. The only time he could truly breathe lately was when she was near him. By January, Clara Bennett had become the favorite subject of hospital gossip. Not because she encouraged attention. Quite the opposite. Clara still moved through Carter Memorial exactly the same way she always had, carrying coffee for exhausted nurses, kneeling beside frightened patients, laughing softly in crowded hallways like warmth itself had somehow learned to walk in human form. But people noticed things. They noticed the CEO of one of the largest hospital systems in the country now spent suspicious amounts of time near the pediatric floor. They noticed Ethan Carter no longer looked irritated whenever Clara interrupted his schedule. They noticed he drank chamomile tea now instead of surviving entirely on black coffee and stress. Most of all, they noticed the way he looked at her when he thought nobody else was paying attention. Clara noticed too, which was exactly the problem. You are smiling at your phone again. Clara looked up instantly from the nurse station, startled. Her best friend Madison leaned against the counter holding patient charts with a knowing smirk stretched across her face. I am not smiling. Madison stared blankly. Clara. Clara looked back down at the message on her phone anyway. Ethan had sent exactly 4 words 30 seconds earlier. Did you eat lunch? That was it. No emojis. No warmth. No unnecessary punctuation. Somehow it still made her heart betray her every single time. Madison snatched the phone gently from Clara's hand before she could protest. Oh my God! Madison whispered dramatically. The Ice King texts now. Clara grabbed the phone back quickly, cheeks turning pink. It is not like that. Hum. Madison narrowed her eyes suspiciously. And I suppose the mighty Ethan Carter just accidentally started drinking tea because he enjoys emotional stability now? Clara tried hiding her smile and failed miserably. Madison gasped softly. You like him? Clara froze. The noise of the hospital suddenly felt distant around her. Phones ringing, elevator bells, rolling carts squeaking across polished floors. Everything faded behind the truth she had been trying very hard not to say out loud. Madison's expression softened immediately. Oh no! Clara laughed nervously under her breath. It is stupid. No, Madison said gently. It is terrifyingly obvious. Clara looked away toward the hallway windows where snow drifted softly beyond the glass. Nothing is happening. Clara. Madison lowered her voice carefully. That man looks at you like breathing gets easier when you walk into a room. Clara's heartbeat stumbled painfully at the words because part of her wanted to believe them. But Ethan Carter was complicated in ways she barely understood. Warm one moment, distant the next. Some days he looked at her like she mattered more than anything else in his carefully controlled world. Other days he disappeared completely behind walls so high she could almost feel them closing. And yet somehow, Clara kept staying. I do not know what this is, Clara admitted quietly. Madison gave her a look full of painful understanding. That usually means feelings are involved. Clara laughed softly despite herself, but her chest still ached. Because deep down, she already knew something dangerous had happened. Somewhere between chamomile tea and snow-covered rooftops and late-night conversations in quiet hallways, she had fallen in love with him. Completely, hopelessly, and Ethan probably had no idea. Later that evening, Clara found him exactly where she expected. Alone inside his office overlooking the frozen Chicago River, sleeves rolled slightly above his wrists, while spreadsheets glowed across giant computer screens. The city lights reflected against the windows behind him in soft silver streaks. Ethan looked exhausted. Again, Clara stepped quietly inside carrying a small paper container. Before you ask, she said lightly, yes, I am here to force-feed you. Ethan looked up immediately, tension easing from his face the second he saw her. Clara noticed that too now. The way his shoulders relaxed around her. The way the coldness disappeared slightly from his eyes. Dangerous details. What is that? He asked. Clara set the container on his desk proudly. Chicken noodle soup. Ethan stared at it suspiciously. You made soup. Do not sound so alarmed. Clara smiled faintly. You skipped lunch again. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. You remember everything. The words came out quieter than he intended. Clara looked at him for a second too long. Some things are worth remembering. Silence settled carefully between them. Ethan held her gaze this time, longer than usual. Clara's heartbeat betrayed her instantly. She looked away first, pretending to organize papers on his desk just to survive the intensity of that look. Ethan noticed her nervousness immediately. What? Clara shook her head quickly. Nothing. That was definitely something. She laughed softly. You are becoming annoyingly observant lately. Ethan almost smiled. Occupational hazard. Clara sat carefully on the edge of the couch near his desk while Ethan opened the soup container. Steam rose gently into the warm office light. How bad is it? She asked quietly after a moment. Ethan glanced up. What? Your father. Ethan's expression shifted immediately. Softer. More tired. The doctors are optimistic. Clara heard the truth hidden underneath the sentence anyway. Optimistic was not the same as improving. Ethan rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw before speaking again. He barely recognizes me some days now. Clara's chest tightened painfully hearing the exhaustion in his voice. Ethan rarely talked openly about fear. That must hurt. He stared down at the soup silently for several seconds. I spent most of my life trying to earn his approval. His voice lowered carefully. And now half the time he cannot even remember what day it is. Clara watched him quietly from the couch. The vulnerable moments with Ethan always felt fragile somehow. like touching cracked glass carefully enough not to break it further. My dad used to forget things near the end too, Clara said softly. Ethan looked up slowly. You never told me he was sick. Clara smiled sadly. Cancer. The word hung gently between them. I was 23. Ethan's face softened instantly. Clara? She shrugged lightly, though emotion flickered briefly across her eyes. He still remembered music, though. Her smile became distant. Every Sunday morning he would dance with my mom in the kitchen while pancakes burned on the stove. Ethan listened carefully, completely focused on her now. Clara laughed quietly through the memory. Terrible dancer. You inherited that? Ethan asked softly. Clara gasped dramatically. Wow, that was rude. He smiled faintly. Small. Real. Clara felt her chest ache again because moments like this made it impossible not to love him. Ethan looked down at the soup container before speaking quietly. I do not think anyone ever took care of me before. Clara's breath caught slightly at the honesty in his voice. That is not true. Ethan looked at her carefully. Not like this. The room suddenly felt smaller around them. Warmer. Clara forced herself to breathe normally. Ethan stood slowly from behind his desk and walked toward the windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Snow drifted softly beneath streetlights below them. Clara joined him near the glass a moment later. Neither spoke immediately. The silence between them no longer felt awkward anymore. Felt familiar. Safe. Ethan glanced sideways toward her. Why do you do it? Clara frowned slightly. Do what? Care so much. His voice carried genuine confusion beneath it. You give pieces of yourself away to everyone in this building every single day. Clara looked out toward the city lights quietly. Because I know what loneliness feels like. Ethan's chest tightened. Clara smiled faintly at the snow outside. And because people survive hard things easier when someone stays beside them. Ethan stared at her profile in silence. The soft gold office lights caught against loose strands of blonde hair near her cheek. Her cardigan sleeves covered part of her hands because she always forgot gloves unless someone reminded her. Everything about Clara felt warm in ways his world had forgotten how to be. You deserve someone who takes care of you too, she whispered suddenly. Ethan looked at her immediately. Clara's cheeks turned pink the second she realized she had said it out loud. But she did not take it back. Their eyes held for one suspended moment too long. Ethan stepped slightly closer without realizing it. Clara's heartbeat thundered painfully against her ribs. She could feel the warmth of him now, hear his breathing in the quiet office. Ethan looked at her like he wanted to say something. Something dangerous. Something honest. Then his phone rang sharply across the room. The moment shattered instantly. Ethan stepped back automatically, tension returning to his expression as reality rushed back in. Clara looked away quickly, heart sinking despite herself. Ethan answered the call, voice turning cold and professional again within seconds. Carter speaking. Clara watched him quietly while he discussed financial reports and board meetings like the softness between them had never existed at all. And for the first time since meeting Ethan Carter, Clara Bennett felt something painful settle quietly inside her chest. Because she was no longer afraid of loving him. She was afraid he would never know how to love her back. The annual Carter Foundation Gala happened every February at the Blackstone Hotel overlooking Grant Park, and everyone in Chicago's medical world treated it like royalty season. Politicians, surgeons, investors, hospital executives. Women in glittering gowns and men in perfectly tailored tuxedos filled the grand ballroom beneath crystal chandeliers while violin music floated softly through the air. Cameras flashed near the entrance as reporters documented donations large enough to change entire hospital wings overnight. Ethan Carter hated every second of it. He stood near the ballroom entrance in a black tuxedo, expression calm and unreadable while board members spoke excitedly around him about funding opportunities and press coverage. To everyone else in the room, Ethan looked exactly like he always did. Controlled, powerful, untouchable. But his eyes kept drifting toward the ballroom doors every few seconds without meaning to. Looking for her. Clara almost did not come. She stood inside her tiny apartment nearly 40 minutes earlier staring at the pale blue dress Madison forced her to wear, nerves twisting painfully in her stomach. "I feel ridiculous," Clara whispered while adjusting the simple silver earrings her mother once owned. Madison rolled her eyes dramatically from the bedroom doorway. "You are literally beautiful. Calm down." Clara laughed nervously. "This is not my world." "Maybe not." Madison softened slightly. "But someone in that ballroom is definitely hoping you walk through those doors tonight." Clara's chest tightened immediately because she already knew who Madison meant, and that terrified her. The drive downtown felt longer than usual beneath the glowing Chicago skyline. Snow still lined the sidewalks from last week's storm, while elegant guests stepped from blacktown cars beneath strings of gold lights outside the hotel entrance. Clara hesitated before entering the ballroom, suddenly overwhelmed by how polished everything looked. Crystal chandeliers reflected against marble floors. Expensive perfume mixed with champagne and piano music. Men in tuxedos spoke confidently about stock markets and surgical investments while women in silk gowns laughed softly beside them. Clara instantly felt like she did not belong. Then she saw Ethan across the room, and every other thought disappeared. He stood near the stage speaking with hospital board members, one hand resting inside his pocket while soft ballroom lights reflected against dark hair and sharp features. Several women nearby watched him openly. Clara understood why. Ethan carried power the way some people carried height, effortlessly. But the moment his eyes landed on her across the crowded ballroom, everything else around him seemed to disappear too. Ethan stopped speaking mid-sentence. Completely. Clara felt her heartbeat stumble painfully beneath her ribs. Ethan stared at her for one suspended second too long before walking directly toward her through the crowded ballroom without another word to anyone. Board members turned in confusion, watching him leave conversations unfinished. Clara barely remembered how to breathe by the time he reached her. Ethan slowed slightly as he approached, eyes moving over her carefully. Pale blue dress, loose curls falling over one shoulder, small silver earrings catching chandelier light. Clara suddenly felt exposed beneath the intensity of his gaze. "You came," Ethan said quietly. Clara smiled nervously. "You sound surprised." Ethan looked at her for another second before answering honestly. "I am." Something warm flickered across Clara's chest instantly. Ethan rarely sounded honest in rooms like this, but around her, honesty escaped him unexpectedly sometimes. "You look—" He stopped abruptly. Clara waited softly. Ethan shook his head once, almost frustrated with himself. "Beautiful." The word landed gently between them. Clara's cheeks turned pink immediately. Ethan noticed. His expression softened almost invisibly. "Thank you," Clara whispered. A photographer nearby suddenly approached them with a bright smile. "Mr. Carter, would you mind a quick photo for the Foundation archives?" Ethan immediately looked uncomfortable. Clara stepped back instinctively. "Oh, I should—" Ethan's hand closed gently around her wrist before she could move away. Warm, firm, familiar. Clara froze instantly. Ethan looked directly at the photographer. "One photo is fine." The photographer positioned them near the ballroom staircase beneath golden lights while guests moved elegantly around them. Ethan stood close enough for Clara to smell cedarwood and winter air beneath his cologne. Her heartbeat became impossible to control. "Relax," Ethan murmured quietly beside her. Clara let out a nervous laugh. "Easy for you to say." "No," he said softly. "It is not." The camera flashed. Then again. Clara glanced sideways toward Ethan during the final photo and found him already looking at her instead of the camera. Something shifted painfully inside her chest at the expression in his eyes. Not cold. Not distant. Something warmer. Something dangerously close to longing. Later that evening, the ballroom buzzed louder as speeches began and donors circulated between tables covered in white roses and candlelight. Clara stood near one of the side balconies sipping sparkling water while watching snow drift softly outside the tall windows overlooking downtown Chicago. "You clean up nicely." Clara turned, smiling softly as Ethan approached beside her. "I was about to say the same thing." Ethan leaned lightly against the balcony railing. Liar. Clara laughed quietly. You always look intimidatingly expensive. That sounds insulting. It was meant affectionately. Ethan smiled faintly. God, Clara loved when he smiled now. Felt rare enough to treasure every single time. They stood together in comfortable silence while music drifted softly from the ballroom behind them. Ethan looked more relaxed tonight than she had ever seen him. The tension usually locked into his shoulders had softened slightly. Maybe because for once, nobody here needed something from him emotionally. Nobody except her. Clara swallowed carefully before speaking. Can I ask you something? Ethan glanced sideways. That depends. Clara smiled faintly. Honest answer only. Ethan nodded once. Okay. Clara looked down briefly at the champagne glasses passing through the ballroom beyond them. What am I to you? Silence. Immediate. Ethan's expression shifted slightly. Clara's heartbeat thundered painfully against her ribs, waiting for his answer. Ethan looked away toward the city lights outside. Clara? She forced herself to continue before fear stopped her. Because lately it feels like... Her voice softened carefully. Sometimes it feels like you need me. Ethan stared at the snowy skyline without speaking. Clara's chest tightened painfully anyway because silence was an answer too. I care about you, she admitted quietly. More than I probably should. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. There it was. The moment he had been avoiding for months. The dangerous line between needing someone and loving them. Between loneliness and vulnerability. Ethan finally looked at her again, jaw tightening slightly. You should not. Clara's face fell almost invisibly. What? Ethan's voice became quieter now. Controlled. You are kind, Clara. He swallowed once. And good. Her eyes searched his face desperately. Ethan. But I am not the kind of man you build your life around. The words hit her harder than she expected. Clara stared at him silently while pain spread slowly across her chest. Ethan looked away first. Coward. That is not fair, she whispered. Maybe not. His voice stayed painfully calm. But it is true. Clara blinked quickly, humiliation burning behind her eyes. Around them, the ballroom still glowed with music and laughter while waiters carried champagne beneath chandeliers. Nobody noticed the quiet heartbreak happening near the balcony windows. Ethan exhaled slowly, forcing distance back into his expression. You deserve someone softer than me. Clara laughed once under her breath. Broken. You really think that is the problem? Ethan did not answer because he already knew the truth. The problem was not that he did not feel something for her. The problem was that he felt far too much. Clara looked at him for one long, painful second before nodding softly to herself, like something inside her had finally cracked quietly into place. Okay, she whispered. Ethan's chest tightened, instantly hearing how small her voice sounded now. Clara stepped back carefully, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her dress, while forcing composure back onto her face. I should probably get home. Ethan instinctively stepped toward her. Clara? No, she smiled politely this time, distant now. It is fine. But it was not fine. Ethan could hear it in the way her voice trembled slightly despite her effort to hide it. Clara turned and walked back into the crowded ballroom beneath glowing chandeliers and violin music without looking back again. Ethan remained frozen near the balcony windows long after she disappeared into the crowd. Snow drifted silently beyond the glass while laughter echoed warmly through the ballroom around him. But for the first time all night, Ethan Carter realized something terrifying. The moment Clara walked away from him, the entire room suddenly felt cold. The silence started the next morning. Ethan noticed it before he even stepped out of the elevator onto the pediatric floor. No soft laugh drifting through the hallway. No chamomile tea waiting mysteriously outside his office. No yellow sticky notes reminding him to eat lunch or sleep before midnight. Just fluorescent lights, rolling carts, distant monitor beeps, cold routine. Ethan frowned slightly while scanning the hallway automatically, looking for her. The realization irritated him immediately. He had made the right decision at the gala. Clara deserved someone uncomplicated, someone emotionally available, someone who would not drag her into the exhausting emptiness that followed him everywhere. He repeated that logic 3 separate times before noon. None of it made the hospital feel less hollow. By afternoon, Ethan finally spotted Clara exiting a patient room carrying charts against her chest. She looked beautiful as always, but different somehow, quieter, controlled in the same painful way he controlled himself. Clara smiled politely the second she noticed him approaching. Politely, that alone felt wrong. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter." Ethan slowed slightly. "Mr. Carter, not Ethan. Never Mr. Carter. Clara." She adjusted the charts in her arms carefully. "Did you need something?" "Need." The word settled strangely in his chest. Ethan stared at her for a second too long before answering. "No." Clara nodded once. Professional. Distant. "Okay." Then she walked past him without another word. Ethan remained standing in the middle of the hallway long after she disappeared around the corner. Something sharp twisted painfully beneath his ribs. That evening, he found himself standing outside his office staring at the empty spot beside his laptop where tea usually waited. Ridiculous. He was a grown man unsettled by the absence of herbal tea and handwritten notes. But it was not really about the tea. It was the silence attached to it. The absence of her. Days passed. Then another week. Clara remained kind to everyone inside Carter Memorial except him. Not cruel. Never cruel. Clara Bennett did not know how to become cruel. But she became careful around Ethan now. Measured. Professional. The late-night conversations disappeared. The rooftop moments vanished. She no longer waited beside him during overnight shifts. No more teasing comments about his coffee addiction. No more tiny routines that somehow turned into the center of his life without him noticing. Ethan told himself this was better. Cleaner. Safer. Then the panic attacks returned. The second one hit during a board meeting Thursday morning. Ethan sat at the long walnut conference table while executives discussed financial restructuring plans around him. Voices blurred together into meaningless noise. His chest tightened suddenly. Breathing became difficult again. Heat crawled painfully beneath his collar despite the cold room temperature. Ethan gripped the edge of the table hard enough for his knuckles to pale. "Not here." One board member paused mid-sentence. "Mr. Carter?" Ethan stood abruptly. "Continue without me." He walked out before anyone could stop him. Fast. Controlled. Barely holding himself together. Ethan locked himself inside the executive restroom down the hallway, bracing both hands against the marble sink while trying to breathe normally. His heartbeat thundered violently against his ribs. But this time Clara was not there. No soft voice grounding him. No warm hand steadying his breathing. Just silence echoing off cold marble walls. Ethan stared at his own reflection in the mirror. Pale. Exhausted. Alone. He suddenly realized something terrifying. Clara had become his safe place without him understanding it. And now he had destroyed it himself. Later that night, snow fell heavily across downtown Chicago, while Ethan sat alone inside his penthouse apartment overlooking Lake Michigan. The space was enormous, modern, expensive, and unbearably empty. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected cold city lights across polished black surfaces while untouched takeout containers sat abandoned on the kitchen counter. Ethan loosened his tie slowly before collapsing onto the couch. Silence swallowed the entire apartment instantly. No music. No conversation. Nothing human. His eyes drifted toward the dark gray knitted gloves Clara made him resting carefully beside the fireplace. Ethan stared at them for a long time, then finally reached for them. The wool still carried the faintest trace of lavender detergent and winter air. Something inside his chest cracked quietly at the familiarity of it. He closed his eyes briefly. Mistake. He had made a mistake. His phone buzzed suddenly against the glass coffee table. Ethan glanced down automatically, heart reacting before logic could stop it. Clara. But the screen only displayed another hospital email. Ethan leaned back heavily against the couch, disappointed enough to disgust himself. What was happening to him? He had spent years mastering loneliness. Years convincing himself emotional distance was survival. Then Clara Bennett walked into his life carrying chamomile tea and warmth and impossible kindness. And suddenly nothing felt survivable without her anymore. The next Monday, Carter Memorial held its annual pediatric donor luncheon inside the hospital atrium. White tablecloths covered every table while local reporters interviewed sponsors near large floral arrangements beneath skylights. Clara stood near the children's art display helping several young patients arrange paintings on easels. Ethan spotted her instantly the second he entered the atrium. Of course he did. His body found her before his mind even caught up anymore. Clara wore soft green scrubs beneath a cream sweater today, loose strands of blonde hair falling around her face, while she laughed quietly at something one little girl whispered to her. Ethan felt the familiar ache immediately. One of the board members approached him near the entrance. "Mr. Carter, the press wants a statement regarding the pediatric expansion project." Ethan barely heard him, because across the room Clara looked happy. And for the first time in weeks, none of that happiness had anything to do with him. The realization hit harder than expected. During the luncheon, Ethan answered questions mechanically, while reporters photographed donations and hospital staff applauded speeches near the stage. But his attention kept drifting back toward Clara. Watching her kneel beside sick children, watching her smile at worried parents, watching other people receive the warmth he suddenly missed with embarrassing desperation. Madison noticed him staring by the third time. She approached carefully during a break between speeches. "You look miserable." Ethan's expression hardened automatically. "Excuse me?" Madison crossed her arms. "You heard me." Ethan glanced away toward the crowded atrium. "I do not discuss personal matters with employees." "Good," Madison replied coolly, "because I am not here as your employee right now." Ethan looked back at her sharply. Madison's eyes softened slightly despite obvious frustration. "She cried after the gala." Ethan's chest tightened instantly. Madison lowered her voice. "Do you have any idea how hard Clara tried not to fall for you?" Ethan swallowed slowly without responding. "She believed in you," Madison continued quietly, "even when everyone else thought you were emotionally impossible." Ethan looked across the room toward Clara again. She stood beneath colorful paper stars helping a little boy tape his drawing onto the wall, smiling softly, completely unaware of the conversation happening about her. Madison followed his gaze carefully. "You know what the worst part is?" Ethan finally spoke quietly. "What?" Madison's expression turned sad. "She still looks for you every time she walks into a room." The words hit him like physical pain because he understood exactly what that felt like now. Madison walked away before Ethan could answer, leaving him standing alone beneath bright hospital lights while applause echoed around the atrium. Across the room, Clara finally glanced toward him unexpectedly. Their eyes met for one suspended second. Ethan saw it immediately, the love still there beneath her sadness. The careful distance she forced herself to maintain anyway. Clara looked away first this time. Ethan felt something collapse silently inside his chest watching her turn back toward everyone else instead of him. And standing there surrounded by hundreds of people inside the hospital he built with his own hands, Ethan Carter realized the most terrifying truth of all. He had spent his entire life afraid of needing someone. But now the one person he needed most was slowly learning how to live without him. The call came at 4:32 a.m. Ethan woke instantly to the sound of his phone vibrating across the dark bedroom nightstand. Chicago still slept beneath heavy clouds outside the penthouse windows, while pale blue dawn barely touched the frozen skyline. Ethan reached for the phone automatically, exhaustion already pressing behind his eyes. Then he saw the hospital number. His chest tightened immediately. "Carter." The voice on the other end softened carefully. "Mr. Carter, it is Dr. Reynolds." Ethan sat upright instantly. Silence stretched for half a second too long. That was all it took. "What happened?" Dr. Reynolds exhaled quietly. "Your father went into cardiac distress around 20 minutes ago." Ethan was already out of bed pulling clothes on before the sentence fully ended. "Is he stable?" Another pause. Longer this time. You should come now. The drive downtown blurred into flashing traffic lights and icy roads beneath a gray February sky. Ethan gripped the steering wheel hard enough to hurt while snow flurries swept across Lakeshore Drive. His heartbeat pounded painfully against his ribs. Not again. Not yet. He was not ready yet. But deep down, Ethan understood something terrifying before he even reached the hospital. Nobody was ever ready for this part. Carter Memorial stood glowing against the cold dawn like a lighthouse in the middle of the sleeping city. Ethan barely remembered parking. Barely remembered crossing the lobby while nurses and security guards stepped aside instantly. The elevator ride to the cardiac floor felt endless. Too quiet. Too slow. When the doors opened, Dr. Reynolds waited near the nurse's station with tired eyes and folded hands. Ethan stopped walking the second he saw the expression on the older doctor's face. Everything inside him already knew. "I am sorry, Ethan." The hallway became silent. Completely silent. Ethan stared at the doctor without reacting at first. Like his mind had simply stopped understanding language. "We did everything we could." Ethan swallowed once. Hard. "What time?" His own voice sounded unfamiliar now. Empty somehow. 4:11. Snow drifted softly beyond the hospital windows while distant monitors beeped somewhere far down the corridor. Life continuing. Normal. Cruelly normal. Ethan nodded once because he did not know what else to do. Dr. Reynolds placed a gentle hand against his shoulder before quietly walking away. Ethan stood alone in the hallway staring at the closed hospital room door in front of him, then slowly stepped inside. The room smelled faintly like antiseptic and stale coffee. Early morning light filtered softly through partially open blinds while machines now sat dark and silent beside the bed. His father looked smaller somehow. Fragile in a way Ethan had never allowed himself to see before. The strongest man he ever knew reduced to stillness beneath white hospital sheets. Ethan walked toward the bed slowly. Every movement felt disconnected from his body. Unreal. Dad. Nothing. Of course nothing. Ethan lowered himself into the chair beside the bed, staring at his father's hand resting motionless against the blanket. He suddenly remembered being 8 years old sitting in this same hospital while his father carried him through the hallways after Ethan broke his wrist falling off a bicycle. He remembered feeling safe back then. Completely safe. Somewhere along the years between grief and ambition and endless work schedules, they had forgotten how to talk to each other without exhaustion standing between them. Ethan rubbed one trembling hand across his face slowly. "I tried," he whispered hoarsely. "I really did." But the room remained silent. 20 minutes later, someone knocked softly against the partially opened door. Ethan looked up automatically, exhausted hope rising painfully inside his chest before logic caught up. Clara. Of course it was Clara. She stepped quietly into the room wearing pale blue scrubs beneath a cream sweater, her expression instantly softening the second she saw him sitting there alone beside the bed. Ethan had never been so relieved to see another human being in his life. Clara walked closer slowly. No rushing. No forced sympathy. Just quiet presence. "I heard," she whispered gently. Ethan looked away immediately because his chest already felt too tight to survive kindness right now. Clara stopped beside him near the chair, eyes moving toward his father before returning softly to Ethan's face. "I am so sorry." Ethan nodded once. Barely. Clara hesitated before resting one hand lightly against his shoulder. Warm. Familiar. Human. The touch nearly destroyed him. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "Everyone keeps saying that." His voice cracked unexpectedly on the final word. Clara's expression broke instantly hearing it. "Hey!" She crouched slightly beside him now. "You do not have to hold yourself together right now." Ethan laughed quietly under his breath. "Broken. I do not know how not to." Clara's eyes filled with sadness. "Ethan." He stood abruptly from the chair, pacing toward the windows because sitting still suddenly felt unbearable. Snow drifted softly outside while morning traffic slowly filled the Chicago streets below. "He built this entire place?" Ethan whispered. "Every hallway. Every wing." Clara listened quietly behind him. Ethan stared out at the city with exhausted eyes. And I spent so much time trying to become him. His breathing turned uneven again. That I never noticed he was disappearing. Clara stepped closer carefully. That is not your fault. Ethan shook his head immediately. I should have been here more. You were here. Not enough. His voice rose painfully. Not in the ways that mattered. Silence filled the room softly. Clara stood beside him now, close enough that he could feel warmth radiating from her presence again. Ethan suddenly looked at her then. Really looked at her. Tired blue eyes. Gentle expression. The same woman who stayed beside him during panic attacks and sleepless nights and unbearable loneliness. The same woman he pushed away because loving her terrified him more than losing himself ever had. Ethan's voice lowered carefully. I do not want to be alone right now. Clara's breath caught slightly hearing the honesty in his voice. But pain flickered behind her eyes too. Because 2 weeks ago, she would have reached for him without hesitation. Now there was distance standing painfully between them. Clara swallowed once before answering softly. You are not alone. Ethan stared at her like he wanted to believe her completely. Then his phone started vibrating again. Another executive. Another board member. Another person needing something from him because the world did not stop just because his heart was breaking quietly inside a hospital room. Ethan silenced the phone immediately. Clara watched him carefully. You should go home after this. Ethan laughed hollowly. Home. The word sounded meaningless now. Clara's expression softened painfully. Ethan leaned both hands against the cold window glass, exhaustion pulling heavily at his shoulders. I do not even know what that means anymore. Clara looked at him silently for several seconds before speaking. Home is not always a place. Ethan turned toward her slowly. Clara's voice became almost unbearably gentle. Sometimes it is just a person who makes life hurt less. The words settled deep into the silence between them. Ethan stared at her while grief and exhaustion and regret tangled painfully inside his chest. Because suddenly he understood the terrifying truth he had been running from for months now. Clara Bennett had become the closest thing to home he had left in this world. And he had already started losing her too.